Hey there, everybody! In this episode, we take you to December 16th, 2004, and bring you yet another absolutely shocking true story of what many would call, deranged woman murdering an innocent mother to take her unborn child for herself. Again, if you have a weak constitution, rather move on. Otherwise, stay tuned to the end to find out what happened to both the psycho and the baby. Now get comfortable and enjoy. Lisa Montgomery was born on February 27, 1968, in Melbourne, Kansas, into a life that seemed cursed from the start. The product of a tumultuous and abusive household, Lisa's childhood was marked by neglect, violence, and a crushing sense of isolation. Her mother, Judy Shaughnessy, was a woman hardened by her own tragic past, and she vented her bitterness on her children. Lisa was the primary target of Judy's rage. She was beaten, verbally abused, and sexually assaulted by her stepfather, who built a small room in the back of the house to carry out his depraved acts in secret. When Lisa tried to seek help, she was met with disbelief or indifference. By the time she reached her teenage years, Lisa was broken. She turned inward, retreating into a fantasy world where she could escape the horror of her daily life. She longed for love, for a family of her own, but her relationships were doomed from the start. Her first marriage at age 18 ended in divorce after a few years. She remarried quickly to a man named Kevin Montgomery, but this relationship was no better. Kevin was controlling and emotionally distant, exacerbating Lisa's already fragile mental state. Lisa's psyche was further damaged by a series of miscarriages that left her feeling worthless and incomplete. She began to weave a web of lies, telling people she was pregnant when she wasn't. It was a desperate attempt to fulfill a longing that had consumed her since she was a child. But each lie only deepened her despair, and as the years passed, her grip on reality began to slip. In her small, rural community, Lisa's erratic behavior was the subject of gossip. People knew she wasn't well, but they didn't know the extent of her suffering. They didn't see the nights she spent alone, crying over the children she would never have. They didn't see the way she stared at pregnant women with a mixture of envy and resentment. And they didn't see the dark thoughts that began to take root in her mind, thoughts that would soon lead her down a path of unimaginable horror. Lisa's story was one of missed opportunities for intervention. Teachers, neighbors, and social workers all saw the signs, but failed to act. Her life could have been different if someone had reached out, if someone had cared enough to break through the walls she had built around herself, but no one did. And Lisa was left to fend for herself in a world that seemed determined to crush her. As Lisa entered her 30s, her obsession with motherhood grew more intense. She began to lie more frequently about being pregnant, even going so far as to wear maternity clothes and fake a growing belly. She told her husband, her children, and her friends that she was expecting, despite the fact that she had undergone tubal ligation years earlier and knew she could never conceive again. The lies were a temporary balm for her deep-seated pain, but they couldn't satisfy her yearning for a child. With each passing day, the pressure mounted. Her husband, Kevin, was growing suspicious. He had been patient with her eccentricities for years, but this was different. He began to question her more closely, and Lisa knew it was only a matter of time before he would demand proof of her pregnancy. Desperation consumed her. She needed a way to maintain the illusion she had created, and the more she thought about it, the more her thoughts turned to a dark and twisted solution. She began to fantasize about finding a pregnant woman, someone who could provide the baby she so desperately wanted. The idea horrified her at first, but as her situation became more dire, it began to seem like her only option. Lisa started searching online for pregnant women, specifically those involved in dog breeding, a hobby she shared. It was through this search that she stumbled upon Bobbie Jo Stinnett, a young woman from Skidmore, Missouri, who was 8 months pregnant with her first child. Bobbie Jo was everything Lisa was not, happy, loved, and eagerly anticipating the arrival of her baby girl. In Bobbie Jo, Lisa saw not only a victim, but also a twisted solution to her problem. She began corresponding with Bobbie Jo under the guise of Darlene Fisher, a fellow dog breeder interested in purchasing one of Bobbie Jo's rat terrier puppies. The emails were polite and friendly, with Lisa carefully building a rapport. Bobbie Jo had no reason to suspect anything was amiss. She was excited to meet a fellow dog lover, and she eagerly agreed to a visit from Darlene to finalize the sale. As Lisa made the arrangements to meet Bobbie Jo, she convinced herself that this was the only way to achieve the happiness she longed for. The moral implications of her plan were buried beneath layers of rationalization and denial. She wasn't thinking about the pain she would cause or the life she would take. All she could see was the baby she would soon hold in her arms, the baby that would finally make her whole. Bobbie Jo Stinnett was a 23-year-old woman who lived a quiet life in the small town of Skidmore, Missouri. She was known for her kindness and her love of animals, especially the rat terriers she bred and sold through online forums. Bobbie Jo had met her husband, Zeb Stinnett, in high school, and the two were thrilled to be expecting their first child, a girl they had already named Victoria Jo. Bobbie Jo's pregnancy was going smoothly, and she was eagerly looking forward to becoming a mother. In December 2004, Bobbie Jo received an email from a woman named Darlene Fisher, who expressed interest in purchasing one of her puppies. The two women exchanged several emails, with Darlene asking detailed questions about the dogs and Bobbie Jo providing enthusiastic answers. Darlene mentioned that she lived in Fairfax, Missouri, just a short drive from Skidmore, and asked if she could come by in person to see the puppies. Bobbie Jo was delighted to have a potential buyer so close to home. She invited Darlene to visit her house on December 16, 2004, and the two arranged a time to meet. Bobbie Jo mentioned the visit to her mother, Becky Harper, who planned to stop by later that afternoon to help with some holiday preparations. On the day of the visit, Bobbie Jo tidied up her modest home, making sure everything was in order for her guest. She didn't think twice about inviting a stranger into her home. After all, this was a small town where people trusted one another. Bobbie Jo had no idea that the woman who would soon arrive at her door wasn't Darlene Fisher at all, but rather Lisa Montgomery, a woman with a sinister plan. Lisa arrived in Skidmore that afternoon, her mind racing with anticipation and fear. She had packed a bag with the tools she would need to carry out her plan: a rope, a kitchen knife, and a diaper bag filled with baby clothes. She had also brought a picture of an ultrasound, a fake birth certificate, and a homemade umbilical cord clamp, items she hoped would lend credibility to her story once she had the baby in her arms. When Lisa knocked on Bobbie Jo's door, she was greeted with a warm smile. Bobbie Jo invited her inside, and the two women chatted about the puppies, the upcoming birth, and life in general. Bobbie Jo was kind and trusting, completely unaware that she had just welcomed a predator into her home. As they talked, Lisa's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She knew what she was about to do, but a part of her still hoped she could back out, find another way to resolve her situation. But the more they talked, the more determined she became. The baby was so close, just a few feet away, growing inside Bobbie Jo's womb. All she had to do was take it. Bobbie Jo was radiant, her pregnant belly a visible sign of the life she was about to bring into the world. Lisa's eyes kept drifting to that swollen belly, her mind a chaotic mix of envy, desire, and fear. This was it, the moment she had been planning for, the moment that would either fulfill her deepest wish or destroy her completely. As they continued to talk, Lisa made her move. She asked to see one of the puppies, a request that Bobbie Jo happily obliged. Bobbie Jo turned her back to retrieve the puppy from its pen, and in that instant, Lisa struck. She grabbed the rope she had hidden in her bag and looped it around Bobbie Jo's neck, pulling it tight. Bobbie Jo struggled, her hands clawing at the rope as she tried to free herself. She gasped for air, her eyes wide with terror as she realized what was happening. Lisa tightened her grip, her heart pounding in her ears. Bobbie Jo's struggles grew weaker, and after what seemed like an eternity, she finally went limp, collapsing to the floor. Lisa stood over Bobbie Jo's lifeless body, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was silent except for the sound of her own breathing and the ticking of a clock on the wall. She had done it. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. But there was no time to dwell on that now. She still had work to do. She pulled the kitchen knife from her bag and knelt beside Bobbie Jo's body. Her hands shook as she positioned the knife over Bobbie Jo's abdomen. She had never done anything like this before, and the thought of cutting into another person's flesh filled her with dread. But she had come too far to stop now. She pressed the blade into Bobbie Jo's skin and began to cut. The process was messy and brutal. Lisa had no medical training, and she struggled to control the knife as it sliced through skin, muscle, and tissue. Blood pooled around Bobbie Jo's body, soaking into the carpet as Lisa worked frantically to free the baby. The sight and smell of the blood made Lisa gag, but she forced herself to keep going, driven by the desperate need to complete her mission. After what felt like an eternity, Lisa finally succeeded in extracting the baby from Bobbie Jo's womb. The baby girl was tiny and covered in blood, but she was alive, her tiny cries filling the room. Lisa stared down at the baby in awe, tears streaming down her face. This was what she had wanted for so long, and now it was finally hers. She wrapped the baby in a towel and placed her in the diaper bag she had brought. Then, with trembling hands, she cleaned up as best she could, wiping the blood from her hands and the knife. She left Bobbie Jo's body where it lay, knowing there was nothing she could do to hide the evidence of her crime. She had to get out of there before anyone found her. Lisa hurried out of the house, clutching the diaper bag to her chest. She got into her car and sped away from Skidmore. her mind racing with a mixture of relief and terror. She had the baby, she had what she had come for, but she also had a dead woman's blood on her hands, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the police would come looking for her. As she drove back to her home in Malvern, Kansas, Lisa tried to calm herself, to convince herself that everything would be okay. She would tell her husband that she had gone into labor early, that she had given birth on the road. She would present the baby as her own, and no one would ever know the truth. But deep down, she knew that was a lie. The truth was bound to come out, and when it did, her life would be over. Lisa arrived home in Malvern just before dusk, exhausted and numb. The baby, now quiet and still, slept in the back seat as Lisa pulled into the driveway. Her husband Kevin was at work, and the house was empty. Lisa took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She had to make this look convincing. She had to play the part of the new mother. She carried the baby inside, her heart racing as she imagined the questions Kevin would ask when he got home. She hadn't thought through the details of her story, but she knew she would have to come up with something believable. The baby was tiny, far too small for a full-term infant, but Lisa hoped that Kevin wouldn't notice. She dressed the baby in the clothes she had packed, wrapped her in a blanket, and laid her in a crib she had set up months earlier. When Kevin arrived home, Lisa greeted him with a forced smile. She told him that she had gone into labor while running errands, that she had given birth in the car on the way home. Kevin was shocked, but he seemed to believe her story. He was too caught up in the excitement of meeting his new daughter to question the details. Over the next few days, Lisa tried to settle into her new life as a mother. She showed off the baby to friends and family, basking in their congratulations and admiration. But underneath her calm exterior, Lisa was a wreck. She couldn't stop thinking about Bobbie Jo, about the blood, the rope, the knife. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't shake the feeling that it was all about to come crashing down. And she was right. In Skidmore, Bobbie Jo's mother, Becky Harper, had arrived at her daughter's house shortly after Lisa left. Becky found the front door open, the house eerily quiet. When she entered the living room, she was greeted by a scene straight out of a nightmare. Bobbie Jo's body lay on the floor, surrounded by blood. Becky screamed, a sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The local police were called to the scene, but it quickly became clear that this was a case beyond their capabilities. The FBI was brought in to investigate, and they soon discovered the emails between Bobbie Jo and Darlene Fisher. It didn't take long for them to trace the emails back to Lisa Montgomery. On December 17, 2004, just one day after the murder, FBI agents arrived at Lisa's home. They found her sitting in the living room holding the baby in her arms. When they confronted her, Lisa broke down and confessed to everything. She was arrested on the spot and the baby was taken into protective custody. The news of Bobbie Jo's murder and the abduction of her baby spread like wildfire, shocking the nation. People were horrified by the brutality of the crime and by the fact that it had been committed by a woman who appeared so ordinary. Lisa's neighbors and friends were stunned. They had no idea she was capable of such a thing. As Lisa sat in a jail cell, awaiting trial, the full weight of what she had done began to sink in. She destroyed not only Bobbie Jo's life, but also her own. There was no escaping the consequences of her actions, no way to undo the damage she had caused. The investigation into Bobbie Jo Stinnett's murder was swift and thorough, led by the FBI with the assistance of local law enforcement. The crime scene was meticulously examined, with agents collecting every piece of evidence that could help build a case against Lisa Montgomery. The emails between Lisa and Bobbie Jo, sent under the alias Darlene Fisher, were key pieces of evidence as they established premeditation and connected Lisa directly to the victim. Forensic experts analyzed the rope used to strangle Bobbie Jo and the knife used to cut her open, both of which had been left at the scene. The items were quickly identified as belonging to Lisa, further solidifying the case against her. Blood samples were taken from the crime scene and matched to both Bobbie Jo and her baby, confirming that the newborn in Lisa's possession was indeed Victoria Jo Stinnett. As the investigation continued, more details about Lisa's troubled past came to light. Her history of mental illness, including diagnoses of bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder, became a focal point. Investigators also uncovered Lisa's history of lying about pregnancies and the tubal ligation procedure she had undergone years earlier, which made it impossible for her to conceive naturally. These findings painted a picture of a woman who was deeply disturbed and driven by a desperate need to fulfill an unattainable dream. In Skidmore, the community was reeling from the loss of Bobbie Jo. The small town, with its population of just a few hundred people, had never experienced anything like this before. Vigils were held in Bobbie Jo's memory, and people struggled to comprehend how such a brutal crime could have happened in their quiet, close-knit community. The Stinnett family was devastated, not only by the loss of Bobbie Jo, but also by the trauma of knowing that their grandchild had been ripped from her mother's womb in such a violent manner. The investigation also revealed that Lisa had researched childbirth and C-sections extensively in the weeks leading up to the murder. She had watched videos, read articles, and even practiced making incisions on a doll. This evidence further demonstrated the premeditation and planning that went into the crime, making it clear that Lisa had been intent on carrying out her plan, no matter the cost. As the investigation progressed, Lisa's mental state became a central issue. Her defense team began to build a case based on her history of mental illness, arguing that she was not fully responsible for her actions due to her severe psychological problems. They pointed to her abusive childhood, her multiple miscarriages, and her delusional belief that she could somehow become a mother again as factors that had driven her to commit the crime. But the prosecution was equally determined to seek justice for Bobbie Jo. They argued that while Lisa was undoubtedly troubled, she was also manipulative and fully aware of what she was doing. They emphasized the meticulous planning that had gone into the crime, from the creation of the fake Darlene Fisher identity to the purchase of the tools used in the murder. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman who was willing to do whatever it took to get what she wanted, regardless of the consequences. As the trial date approached, the nation watched with morbid fascination, eager to see how the case would unfold. The media descended on Skidmore, turning the small town into a temporary circus as reporters and camera crews documented every development. The Stinnett family, overwhelmed by grief and anger, did their best to avoid the spotlight, focusing instead on caring for Victoria Jo, who had miraculously survived the ordeal. Lisa Montgomery's trial began on October 1, 2007, in the U.S. District Court in Kansas City, Missouri. It was a trial that captured the attention of the nation, not only because of the horrific nature of the crime, but also because of the complex issues surrounding Lisa's mental health. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal experts, and members of the public, all eager to see how the case would unfold. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Roseanne Ketchmark, laid out a compelling case against Lisa. They detailed the meticulous planning that had gone into the crime, presenting evidence of Lisa's internet searches, her email exchanges with Bobbie Jo, and the tools she had purchased for the murder. The prosecution also called witnesses who testified about Lisa's history of deceit, particularly her pattern of lying about pregnancies. They argued that Lisa had been driven by a selfish desire to steal another woman's baby, and that she had carried out the murder with full knowledge of what she was doing. One of the most damning pieces of evidence presented by the prosecution was the video of Lisa's confession. In the video, Lisa calmly described how she had strangled Bobbie Jo, cut her open, and taken the baby. Her demeanor in the video was chilling. She showed little emotion, speaking in a matter-of-fact tone that left the courtroom stunned. The prosecution used this video to argue that Lisa was not only capable of committing the crime, but that she had done so without remorse. The defense, led by public defender Frederick Duchard, focused on Lisa's troubled past and her severe mental health issues. They argued that Lisa had been driven to commit the crime by a combination of factors, including her abusive childhood, her multiple miscarriages, and her delusional belief that she could somehow become a mother again. The defense called expert witnesses who testified about Lisa's mental state, describing her as a woman who was deeply disturbed and suffering from a range of psychological disorders, including bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder. One of the key points of the defense's case was that Lisa had been suffering from pseudocyesis, a rare psychological condition in which a woman believes she is pregnant and exhibits physical symptoms of pregnancy, despite not actually being pregnant. The defense argued that Lisa's belief in her own pregnancy had become so entrenched that she had lost touch with reality, leading her to commit the crime in a desperate attempt to complete her pregnancy. The defense also highlighted the role of Lisa's abusive upbringing in shaping her behavior. They called witnesses who testified about the horrific abuse Lisa had endured as a child, including the sexual assaults by her stepfather and the emotional and physical abuse by her mother. These witnesses painted a picture of a woman who had been deeply scarred by her past and who had never received the help she needed to heal. The trial was extremely emotionally charged, with both sides presenting compelling arguments. The jury was faced with a difficult decision: whether to see Lisa as a cold-blooded killer or as a deeply troubled woman who had been driven to commit a terrible act by forces beyond her control. As the trial progressed, the nation watched with bated breath. In the end, the jury found Lisa Montgomery guilty of kidnapping resulting in death, a federal crime that carried the possibility of the death penalty. The verdict was met with a mixture of relief and sorrow by those who had followed the case. For the Stinnett family, the verdict was a small measure of justice for the loss of Bobbie Jo, but it could never truly heal the wounds that had been inflicted. On April 4, 2008, Lisa Montgomery was sentenced to death by lethal injection, making her the first woman in the United States to receive a federal death sentence in more than 50 years. The sentence was handed down by U.S. District Judge Gary Fenner, who cited the brutal and premeditated nature of the crime as justification for the death penalty. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. Lisa's defense team immediately announced their intention to appeal the sentence, arguing that the death penalty was an inappropriate punishment for a woman with such severe mental health issues. They continued to emphasize Lisa's history of abuse and her mental illness, arguing that she should be spared the death penalty and instead be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The appeals process dragged on for years, with each new filing bringing renewed attention to the case. Lisa's lawyers argued that her trial had been unfair, that crucial evidence about her mental health had been overlooked, and that the death penalty was a disproportionate punishment given her troubled past. They also pointed to the fact that Lisa had been diagnosed with severe mental illnesses, including bipolar disorder and complex post-traumatic stress disorder, both of which had gone untreated for most of her life. But despite these arguments, the courts consistently upheld the death sentence, ruling that the crime was so heinous that it warranted the ultimate punishment. As the years passed, Lisa remained on death row, her fate uncertain. The case became a focal point for debates about the death penalty, mental illness, and the criminal justice system, with advocates on both sides arguing passionately for their positions. For the Stinnett family, the long legal battle was a painful reminder of the loss they had suffered. They struggled to move on with their lives, knowing that the woman who had taken Bobbie Jo from them was still alive, still fighting to escape the consequences of her actions. The birth of Victoria Jo had been a bittersweet moment for the family, as they were overjoyed to have her in their lives but devastated by the circumstances of her birth. As the years went by, Lisa's mental health continued to deteriorate. She became increasingly withdrawn, spending most of her time in isolation. Her lawyers and supporters argued that she was no longer capable of understanding the punishment that awaited her, and that executing her would be a cruel and inhumane act. But the courts remained unmoved, and the date of her execution drew ever closer. On January 13, 2021, Lisa Montgomery was executed by lethal injection at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana. She was the first woman to be executed by the federal government in nearly 70 years. The execution was carried out in the early hours of the morning, with only a small group of witnesses present. Lisa's final moments were quiet, her life ending as it had been lived, in pain and isolation. The execution of Lisa Montgomery marked the end of a tragic and horrifying chapter in American legal history. It was a case that had raised difficult questions about justice, mental illness, and the limits of compassion. For the Stinnett family, the execution brought a sense of closure, but it could never erase the pain of losing Bobbie Jo in such a brutal and senseless manner. Victoria Jo Stinnett, the baby who had been at the center of the crime, grew up surrounded by the love and support of her family. She was too young to remember the events of that fateful day, but the story of her birth would always be a part of her life. The Stinnett family did their best to shield her from the darker aspects of her past, focusing instead on giving her a happy and normal childhood. And that brings us to the end of this story. Please share your views on this tragic event. Do you believe in the death penalty? Do you think something could have and should have been done to prevent this? And please remember to report the like button to the traffic police, and while you're at it, go ahead and include his buddy, the subscribe icon. Also, check out this gruesome story on your screen right now. You will not believe what this rich sicko did to his beautiful girlfriend simply because he was delusional and saw things that were never there. Much love, till next time. Stay safe.